I was brought to these graves probably in 2011, so over a decade now, by a local who grew up in the area. I grew up about 15, 20 miles north of here, but my friend was from the region and she brought me here because of this particular headstone, specifically the one on the left that you see with the cracked pavement. And what you'll see is that this belonged to one Annie M. Silvers, who belonged, and we'll look at the headstone in more detail in subsequent slides. I know it's hard to read here, especially with the fading. But it says, Annie M. Woodman belonged to the women of woodcraft, born April 18th, 1876, sorry, April 16th, 1876, died October 5th, 1906, which would make her 230 years old at the time of death. As a result, my friend said growing up in the area, the folklore was that she was a witch, and she belonged to a sacred coven called the Women of Woodcraft, and had lived to 230 years of age. So, what I'm going to try to talk about today is what is so special about Annie Silver's grave and headstone, and subsequently, why is she a witch, and what does her being a witch tell us about cemeteries, life, and life after death more broadly in a sort of anthropological frame. So if you're driving north on Highway 70 in Northern California, you'll come to what's called Table Mountain. It's a rather fascinating geological feature. You can see, you can see this sort of straight plateau. You can go hiking up here, it's quite gorgeous. And just below that is a large O. Now, a lot of people growing up there thought it was supposed to be like the famous Hollywood sign, but being Northern California and rather rural and poor, they could never finish it. Turns out it has a more interesting story. It's from local high schoolers who managed to do this all from the valley, walking up groups of cement and doing it over the course of 90 days, using nothing but mirrors and basic trigonometry to effectively pour a large O. But driving north, you often hear this story of it being the sort of poor man's Hollywood sign. So we're going to be situated here in the Central Valley of Northern California, really quite at the foothills up here in the northern portion here of Oroville. Now, when we start getting into some of the archival data, what we find out is it's not called Oroville, it's called Overt. And this starts to become a bit of a headache for me looking at archival data because there was in fact another Ophir about 70 miles or so southeast of here. And it turns out that this Ophir actually established their post office first, so the Ophir that I know as Oroville had to change their name, so they changed it to Oroville, or the City of Gold. A lot of this has to do with where gold was found during the major gold rush in the mid-19th century. So you oftentimes see this in the King James Version. They went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. So you end up having, during the 1848-1849 gold rush, a tremendous number of towns, all in the foothills of California, all named in some sort of biblical reference to the town of Ophir. All fine and well until they all start to set up post offices. Then they end up having to pick one. So then they all change to some other form of gold or silver illusion, which is where the town Oroville gets its name. So when we go up to the top of Oroville, what you can see is this rather gorgeous lake that's now called Lake Oroville. But it turns out this is a man-made lake, and this is really important, and we can't really understand much about Annie Silver's headstone unless we understand some of the water infrastructure that happened here. So the Pioneer Cemetery where she was buried was commissioned in 1965 as an aggregation of burials that were displaced, specifically the cities or upstart towns of Bidwell's Bar, Enterprise, and other familial plots that the lake would displace later on through impoundment. Following World War II, there was a massive boom, and especially in the Central Valley of settlements, and water started to really recede in many portions of the Central Valley, which was a problem for agriculture, with California's agriculture still being one of the most predominantly lush agricultures in the entire world. The Central Valley needed copious amounts of water to handle the post-war boom. So what they started doing is impounding many different rivers up in the northern portions of the Sierras, specifically to make lakes to funnel water, hydroelectric power, and agricultural water into the Central Valley for agriculture. And so as a result, when they did this impoundment, they realized many of these other towns and burial plots were going to have to be moved. And in fact, on the right-hand side, we see this very famous tree called Mother Orange Tree, or Mother Orange Grove in Northern California. Sort of bizarrely was known for its orange produce, not something that a lot of people there today would think of it as. It's predominantly more rice agriculture now. But during the 20th century, it was a tremendously fertile area from oranges that were imported from Mazatlan in Mexico. And so we actually see the commemoration here. This is former president, and at the time, Governor Ronald Reagan. These are recolored photos, they would have been taken in black and white, for the dedication ceremony held on May 4th, 1968, just after the creation of the Oroville Dam and the formation of the lake that would go on to displace these burials. So you can see on the left-hand photo, the commencement itself, and then this is where it would have taken place looking southward. Most of you might know Oroville from the tragedy, or at least the crisis that occurred in February 2017 with the rupturing of the spillway. This made national news and international news. These are some of the photos that happened right after the initial rupturing. It created a tremendous amount of damage and mudslide into the local area, into the Thermalito Reservoir, as well as into Northern California. The Oroville Dam is to date, the reservoir, Lake Oroville, is one of the largest lakes in the western portion of the United States, second only to the Shasta Reservoir. And Oroville Dam is the tallest dam in the United States, beating out Old Hoover Dam by about 50 feet. So it's actually bigger or taller than the Hoover Dam. But this was a massive, massive crisis, and in fact, a lot of archaeologists today working in the area in cultural resource management or in mitigation techniques work as a result of this spillway and still trying to track a lot of the damage that it did to local sites. So if you go up to the Pioneer Cemetery, you'll see this sign, and I know it's very hard to read, but it effectively says that the Pioneer Cemetery was formed as a result of the displacement for Bidwell Bar Cemetery, Enterprise Cemetery, and 6 additional familial plots in local rural areas. And then they would commission this area for this particular cemetery. So that helps explain a little bit of how she got here. In fact, if we look at a map, this is very typical of those of us who've grown up in California. You can see the tremendous amount of drought going on, what the lake line should have been like versus what it was observed here, in this case in 2020. But we can see Bidwell Bar and Enterprise, which are now completely inundated with water. There are even some historic photos prior to the movement of these cemeteries, and where these headstones and burials would have been exhumed and subsequently moved to where they are now, the Pioneer Cemetery, which is right off of the Thermalito Reservoir. The sort of irony of this is that the spillway ruptured right here and damaged everything in this region. So they effectively moved a bunch of burials that the lake would displace to put them in a safer region, which would later become damaged by the very rupturing of the lake that displaced them. So when you park initially at the cemetery, a lot of people tend to think that there are 2 cemeteries, and in fact they'll jumble them together into the Thompson Flat Pioneer Cemetery. It's not quite that simple. They share a fence line, but it's a bit more complicated than that. So here's the parking lot that you can get to here. You can see some of the Thermalito Reservoir, which would come over here. The local Agency Formation Commission, or LAFCO, is the one who manages the Thompson Flat Cemetery, whereas the Department of Water Resources, again established in 1965 as a result of creating this lake, manages the adjacent cemetery. So anything in this Pioneer plot is going to be from the displacement from the lake, from those 2 sites we looked at earlier, versus the LAFCO Cemetery next door is going to be responsible for all the burials in the sort of nearby region that's been serving the community. But it does make for some interesting visits. The amount of times I've gone to the cemetery have been a lot. But it means that they have to have someone from Department of Water Resources patrolling this cemetery versus someone from LAFCO patrolling this cemetery, despite them sharing the exact same fence and boundary line. So if you're in one cemetery, they often have to call an agent to get someone from the other agency to come patrol. So this gets into the issue here of what's so special about Annie Silver's grave. And what you'll probably notice is when you're standing at the foot of her grave, is that there's another burial adjacent right next to her. And this belongs to one Ezra J. Silvers. My friend who was from the area who told me about the whole folklore in the beginning said that Ezra was likely her daughter given the smaller headstone and where it was located. You'll also notice that Annie's on the left here is broken. The entire cement cap has been broken. And so when we look up close, we see again Annie M. Silvers, April 16, 1676 to October 5th, 1906, versus Ezra J. Silvers, who's going to have a much more modest date of 1867 to 1950. So much more within the realm of possibility here. Ezra J. Silvers has a pretty classic, what we call in a more traditional monument form, die-on base, a very simple, modest headstone that was very typical of the 20th century. Versus Annie's is going to be more of a tab and socket style headstone, but with accompanying tree-like iconography. That is at the very top. You'll notice this log is actually carved here to make it look like a tree or a log. It's flanked by these branches. There's this small fence with a dove having a branch in its mouth. So it's got this sort of wood iconography going on here. And it turns out that these are very common, despite being very uncommon in this cemetery. So Annie's definitely sticks out. It's an otherwise very sort of simple, humble, I would say very traditional Christian pioneer cemetery in terms of iconography. Not so much for Annie. It looks a lot different, but there are plenty of these exact same insignias you can find all over. And a lot of the folklore that goes into interpreting Annie is in this realm of what does it mean by the women of woodcraft. It's got to be some sort of code for a women of witchcraft or something like that. The Women of Woodcraft were a subsidiary of the larger Woodmen of the World organization, a fraternal organization aimed at providing insurance to its members. So the Woodmen of the World was founded in 1890 by Joseph Cullen Root in Omaha, Nebraska, so actually not far from here, and that's where their headquarters still is today. Helped provide insurance and annuities through fraternal organization. Their first death claim was paid out to a drowning victim, Willie O. Warner, who died on June 14, 1891 in Niles, Michigan. And subsequently, you have the formation of a sort of feminist or female-only auxiliary established on the West Coast in Portland, Oregon, by the founding of Carrie Van Orsdal. So she ends up creating a subsidiary to make it the Women of Woodcraft as a sort of large subsidiary to the larger umbrella of Women Like Wood. They end up providing headstones, both the Woodmen of the World and the Women of Woodcraft, up until about the 1920s, when costs start to become prohibitive and they have to scale back the providing of headstones. From the 1920s onwards, they still do provide some headstones, but oftentimes no longer is it free. You're going to have to pay some form of payment, and then they discontinue them altogether in the late 1920s to 1930s just because costs of monuments became so prohibitively expensive. In 1917, the Women of Woodcraft actually changed their name to the Neighbors of Woodcraft. So this gives us a pretty good clue then of when Annie would have potentially died, right? It means her headstone must have been formed sometime between 1897, when we first established the Women of Woodcraft, and 1917, before they changed their names over to the Neighbors of Woodcraft. So they provide a lot of these headstones, discontinue them in the 20s, as I said. The Neighbors of Woodcraft then rejoined the larger Woodmen of the World organization in the early 2000s. And today you can even still navigate their website from the 2010s onward. The Woodmen of the World was rebranded to Woodmen Life Insurance Corporation. Again, their larger headquarters is still stationed in Omaha, Nebraska. So when we look at things like headstones, there's a lot that goes into how you would have purchased a headstone at the time in the early 20th century. And this is where we start to see things like the Sears Roebuck catalog, which would later become the Sears Corporation, really starts to market this heavily towards the public. And what we can see from some of the local charters looking at Chico and Oroville specifically are the directory of fraternal organizations. So in 1907, we see that the Great Oak Camp number 136 met every Wednesday of each month at KFP Hall here in Chico. So that's pretty contemporaneous with when Annie probably would have actually died based on her headstone death date. For the Arcade Polk, Chico, and Oroville directory, we see that the Women of Woodcraft, at least the Pacific Circle, would have met in the IOOF Hall. This is the International Order of Oddfellows House. So we can see that these members were actually quite active in the local Northern California area. This is a historical photo of the IOOF home in Orange Grove in Oroville, California. So this is where Annie would have been a member and visited on these Wednesdays for monthly meetings, or is within this IOOF home. This is a historical photo of in fact they've already rebranded at this point to the Neighbors of Woodcraft, but this would have been the Silver Oak Circle. So this would have been the neighboring town of Chico. So I have not yet found any historic photo of the Pacific Orange Grove Circle, which Annie would have been a member to in Oroville, but the neighboring one you can see here in Chico. So then what about archival evidence, right? We see that she had lived 230 years. How is this possible? What does some of the archival data say? And let's start with the census. So the 1900 US federal census lists Annie, if we zoom in really close, as the wife to Ezra J. Silvers. So Ezra, for many of you, might not be surprisingly a male name, but in the local area, it's very uncommon today, and as a result, it's often misinterpreted that the headstone next to Annie was her daughter, when in fact it was her husband, who died much later. But we see that the death date here is listed as January 1877, okay? Or birthday, excuse me. Rather than the April 6th, 1676 that we see down here. Okay, so in this case, it likely would have been something like a mischip. That is, after the headstone has already been created, the one who is commissioned to create the actual name, especially the women of woodcraft and woodmen of the world, would have had a lot of preformed headstones in this very distinctive iconography. The only thing they're missing is the name, birth dates, and death dates. They would carve those last. So what likely happened in this case is that the 1676 is carved. You're not going to throw the whole thing away because it was very costly. So you would have still used it and then carved the correct date for the death date. I wanted to just confirm this by following up a bit more, just to try to see if I can go backwards another 20 years and see when she was born. So this is looking at the 1880 U.S. federal census. And if we look really closely at the bottom, we see that her maiden name was Woodman, sort of ironic that she belonged to the women of woodcraft and woodmen of the world. But she was daughter to a very famous newspaper publisher in the area, Carl or Charles Woodman. And we see that she's listed here as Anna at age 4 in 1880. The 1905 to 1929 death index has an entry for her where it says that the age at the time of her death was 30 years with the death date of approximately October 8, 1906. Anyone who's worked with a lot of 19th and 20th century archival material will know that there's always going to be a bit of discrepancies versus what the actual birth date and death date were. So some of these days or times or years might be off by a little bit, but it generally confirms our idea that she was probably 30 years at the time of death as opposed to 230 years at the time of death. So that sort of helps us explain some of the death date. That is, the death date looks accurate on the headstone, it's the birth date that's so wrong or out of it. Following up, I saw a number of newspaper clippings on the obituary and funeral of Annie Silvers. These were really powerful to read through, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but they oftentimes spoke to how loved she was by her family and community members, and that it was a rather tragic passing. The best I've been able to construct as of now is that she had some form of disease or ailment that basically left her bedsick for a prolonged period of time to where she effectively wasted away to death. I know from other historical data that in this particular town of Enterprise, typhoid was pretty high as a form of fever, and oftentimes many people would die of typhus. Whether that happened to her, I just haven't been able to confirm yet. And after that, the archival evidence just sort of exploded, trying to find more on her family, and other members. I'll try to distill that into a very basic genealogy here. And so we're going to start with Ezra, her husband's son. So Joseph A. Silver seems to have emigrated, was born in 1813 on the island of Fayal, which is in the Azores in the mid-Atlantic, one of the larger regions of Portugal. My dissertation research is all on skeletal material from Portugal. I will tell you it's very uncommon to find someone from 20th century or 19th century Fayal named Joseph A. Silver. That's a very anglicized name. More likely, if I were to go to Fayal and look at the archives, it would be João de Silva. That was a much more common name, but it's oftentimes anglicized when you got to Ellis Island and emigrated into New York. But he met Maria Leroy from Ireland. They then had 4 children, Leroy, Mary, Ernest, and Ezra. In terms of Annie's parents, Ella Hand marries Carl D. Woodman, again, Carl or Charles in some cases. His headstone says Carl, was a big newspaper buff in the area, and they have a number of kids, Anna, Harlan, Layla, and Ernest. Anna Woodman marries Ezra J. Silver to become Mrs. Annie Silvers, as you often see in the newspapers, and they have 3 children of their own, Genevieve, Leslie, and Harlan. After Annie's death, Ezra seems to actually move south in Southern California and remarry to a Lily R. Goulden, but it is kind of interesting that she dies about 5 years before he does, in 1945, which sort of begs the question, was he actually physically reburied next to Annie? Did he go be buried with his first wife, or is it just an epitaph? Is it just a headstone to commemorate that he was once married to her, but his body's actually not there, and it's actually somewhere in Southern California? This is something I'm still trying to follow up on. But they have 3 children, and best to my knowledge, we have not found any evidence that they had any children themselves, so this would have been her last surviving relatives, and therefore has no descendants living today. When we look at the Pioneer Cemetery, with just a very basic map. I'll try to color code this section where these different graves are. So Ezra and Annie are buried right next to each other, side by side, again with these cement caps. Whereas Annie's siblings, Harlan and Ernest, are buried a little bit more to the east, over here. Annie's mother, Ella Hand, is buried over here, where her father, Carl, is buried way over here. So it's a curiosity for me to know, or to ask whether or not the original spatial organization of the cemetery and enterprise before the formation of the lake was maintained. I find it quite odd that they have people sort of distributed in this way in this new cemetery. Again, they're aggregating with a whole, another whole cemetery from Bidwell Bar, which would have been a huge mining town, as well as various family plots. So it's possible that the spatial organization and enterprise was not maintained in any sort of systematic fashion, or they simply put people together who had similar last names. That's another possibility. So then we get into some of the stuff that I find really interesting in the ways in which people are engaging with this feature today. So there's a tremendous history of vandalism in this particular cemetery, the Pioneer Cemetery specifically. We see this advertisement here posted on a tree: vandalized property within the cemetery is a serious crime. That sign has been, ironically, defaced. If you go to the Pioneer Cemetery, in various instances, I've seen tremendous amounts of spray paint tagging done over the entry as well as the various graves. When we get to Annie's headstone, you will have noticed that it's never actually been on its base properly in any of the photos I've showed you. And that's in part because ever since it's been here, at least for a long period of time, it has been dislodged. If you look really closely at the base of the monument itself, of the base as well as the headstone, you'll see these relief marks and scuffs. This was certainly crowbarred off and pried off of its base to tip it over. It's a very top-heavy headstone. There have been a number of attempts to repair it. Each time they have repaired it, subsequent vandalism has been inflicted to remove the headstone once again. Rather surprisingly, people have now started to do this to Ezra's too. As you can see on the left-hand photo, this is a more recent photo I took in 2021, where someone came in with a crowbar in attempts to sort of dislodge Ezra's headstone off as well, because Annie's had already been done. If you look on the right-hand photo, you'll notice there's some spray painting here, L and C, and there's a number of other characters that you often find spray painted on top of the cement caps protecting the graves. Those are usually removed, again, by the Department of Water Resources fairly quickly, but then there's almost always new tagging coming in. This is the back of Annie's headstone. It's been incredibly scraped and scuffed. This is really hard to see, so I've done my best to try to show, in part just from large amounts of fading. But on the left, there's an inscription here that says, "In Annie," that someone has etched in. So if you look really closely here, you can see this "In Annie." On the right-hand side, it's incredibly faded, so if we do a color filter here, there's something to the effect of "ing" or "ling" or "sing," the word she told me to write, P.S. she is killing to something something your grave. So people have been etching in this headstone for quite some time as well. This was a Facebook post from a group called American Mysteries, which tries to look at various sensational mysteries or ghosts or any sort of ghost stories that are going on in various parts of the U.S. They happened to focus and do a feature on this headstone, and this individual said back in the 90s there were weird things scratched into the grave. It said, "Hear her words, whisper her name," and had symbols all over it. Many times it was knocked over, and many times money would be placed all around the base of this grave. They go on to sort of inquire how the women of the world, the women of woodcraft, could maybe have a claim and try to figure this out, what's going on. The left-hand photo in this case is from Find a Grave, a large online database for citizens sort of logging of headstones around the United States with different dates. It's a tremendous resource if you haven't checked it out, but you can see in the background of this photo, if you look closely, more tagging going on. Someone has completely spray painted over most of the base of the cement cap. I've reached out to the person who took this photo, still never heard back, so they never had a photo of what the spray paint said. I would have been very curious to learn what was there, but the Department of Water Resources had cleaned it up by the time I got there. The photo on the right is one that I took. You see that the cement is cracked in both cases here. Certainly a lot more faded, right, in the span of 10 years. About a decade, it's been much more faded as well as defaced in certain areas here. It's not to say that it's only been vandalism. A number of people have also tried to provide a certain sense of care to the headstone as well. So this is a comment from Find a Grave from a particular individual left in 2016, which said, I hope you're still resting in peace. Sorry for what vandals have done to your stone. I'm going to drive up this weekend and try and fix it this weekend. So there's a number of people who also engage with it in a non-malicious way, we might say. This is one instance I went and I found not only a twig and a number of cigarette butts at the base, but a bottle of wine and various fossil bones from local mammals there at the base. In this case, you oftentimes, if you go to her headstone, see tremendous amounts of coins left here, specifically pennies, dimes, quarters, sometimes pebbles as well. And then oftentimes flower offerings as well. Sometimes real, sometimes fake. So in this case, we have a dried out bouquet that was left here versus plastic flowers that are sometimes left on her grave as well. The left-hand photo we see here is from another Facebook post. It shows just the sheer amount of material sometimes people will leave on the base of her headstone. There's a stone here painted in pink with blue text that says you are magical. Lots of rocks, stones, coins, bottle caps, plastic flowers, a railroad spike. And then on the right hand is a photo I took, again plastic flowers. The You Are Magical rock has seen better days, but now we can see in this part candle wax that has been burned. So there have been candles lit on top of the base itself or on the cement cap, which have since sort of melted into the base. So what I would say is that this is a very active site. So this is just going to be a quick seriation of photos that I've gathered online or that I took myself. These don't represent all the photos, but just to give you a sense. So if we start even in 2008 with this Find a Grave posting, we see that the headstone has been knocked off its base, turned around and propped up against the back of where it should be, right? So it's effectively backwards and leaning on its own base. Versus 2015, I noticed that it's now been rotated and is now on its back on the ground. 2016, roughly in the same place I had seen it in 2015, still on the ground, with the front text still facing up towards the sky. But 2016, a bit later, someone had now rotated it and tried to lift it to put it back, but had just sort of left it here on top of the cement cap. By 2018, it's now propped again, like it was 10 years earlier, right, up against the base. Still propped here. If you look a little closer in this case, you'll notice the text seems a lot more black. Someone is coming through with a Sharpie and crayon and colored in Women of Woodcraft specifically, left everything else blank. Here the headstone is now standing completely upright, no longer leaning on its base. Again, same sort of position now with a bottle of wine, bones and twigs. And then here it's now on the other side of the base, leaning. So my point is to say that usually, in my experience, headstones don't do this. Usually they tend to stay pretty still, right? So this is a pretty interesting thing to see a headstone receive so much movement in this a little over 10 years, right? So there's a lot of people engaging with this headstone constantly. And another sort of fascinating Facebook group dive. This one was from the Paranormal Activity Society of the local portion of Northern California. They did a whole special on whether or not there was any sort of paranormal activity based on their analyses in this area. They effectively say, according to local legends, one of the graves of the Pioneer Cemetery was the grave of the witch. The reason people believe this was the tombstone states she was a member of the Women of Woodcraft, which was code. They get the dates a little wrong here, 1672 versus 76, but effectively say making her really old. They go on to say Women of Woodcraft actually has nothing to do with witchcraft. They're an insurance agency. Pretty much everything I told you. The dates seem to be wrong. It was probably a mischip. And they actually even go on to say all the paranormal activity they found in their analyses are in the other cemetery managed by LAFCO. None of it was in this cemetery, which is pretty interesting. But they do say here, and this is, for me, been very hard to verify, but for at least 40 years now, people have been doing seance and cult ceremonies at that woman's grave in belief that she was a witch. And that would sort of tie in with some of the things that we end up seeing left at her gravestone, the specific types of candles burned, etc. This is from a fairly recent engagement, so this was someone posting in February 18, 2022, so not that long ago, saying, current photo out at the cemetery, so many people paying respects with last night's full moon. You can see candles lit, pumpkins used. It's very difficult to see in this dark photo. I wish I had a better one from this poster. But it's a cone-like object with a full moon drawn with various forms of crescent moons on it. And so this likely is part of local observances in some sort of harvest. protection ceremony or maybe contemporary Wicca practices. They've been kind of hard for me to pin down, in part because the people who visit this are very ephemeral, and they oftentimes aren't trying to engage with people except for others who believe what they do with this particular headstone. But I think what's really interesting here is this idea of her being a witch, because she's a woman who had lived purportedly at 230 years of age, has this sort of coven-like code for women of woodcraft, as opposed to some sort of real insurance agency that we know today. So I don't think we can overlook the fact that the U.S.'s history of witch persecutions in all its forms, nor the U.S. history doesn't factor into the vandalism that we see here. So we're pretty far removed from the 17th century witch persecution trials on the East Coast in Salem, but a lot of us tend to, I think, understand witches as oftentimes female, not realizing that many of the people who were tried and hung during the witch trials of Salem were men, and 2 of the instances of the victims were dogs who were accused of witchcraft. So it goes to show that if you actually were to go back and look at some of the Salem witch trials themselves, there's a much more complicated, nuanced gender component here. Even though the majority were women, it wasn't exclusively women. But I think oftentimes with contemporary Wicca culture, a lot of that tends to lean more female. And in fact, Giles and Martha Corey, this is going to be depicted somewhat gruesomely in the center photo, were a couple who lived and similarly suffered tragic fates during the Salem persecutions. Martha, despite being in good standing with the community and church, was accused of witchcraft and hanged on September 2nd, 1692. Her husband Giles attempted to defend the accusations against his wife, but was subsequently accused of witchcraft himself for defending her. Refusing to go to trial, he was pressed to confess, an excruciating torture process whereby the individual is placed between 2 substrates and slowly crushed with various stones. And that's what you're seeing here, the crushing of Giles Corey. So a number of the victims in these cases were in fact men. So returning to Annie's vandalism, I guess I wonder to this day, if Charles or another male's headstone were mischipped in a similar manner, would we have had the same sort of result? Would we see the same amount of engagement with potential local people to care for her headstone or for practice seances, or to vandalize her headstone? And I suppose I don't quite think so. I think a lot of it happens to be a confluence of factors of her being a very gendered name of Annie Silvers, having this 230-year birth and death date that's literally carved in stone, right? Mixed with this otherwise very unorthodox iconography in an otherwise humble Christian cemetery. And the U.S., of course, is no stranger to systematically denying peace and permanence or places of proper burial and rest for those associated with cemeteries. We've seen this throughout the U.S. history for people of color, immigrants, impoverished communities. Pauper cemeteries were looted en masse for the medical schools for cadaver dissection. What we see in Annie's headstone likely goes to show that violence, inequality, and contestation are struggles that continue to play out post-mortem even after death. And so the only other headstone that shows this amount of toppling would be Anna Margaret Close. This is a photo on the left here from Sandra Bessett, 2008. By the time I had seen this much later in 2015, the headstone had been partially toppled over and then further jumbled and damaged in the last few years. This one, the headstone and ancestor who this belongs to, does have a descendant who is from and still lives in the local community today. So their pain is very much felt as they've seen their great-grandmother's headstone continuously vandalized. So the question then becomes, what does Annie Silvers, as represented by a headstone at least, and purported witch, reveal about broader anthropological ideas of cemeteries, engagement with the dead, and life after death more broadly? And this is a bit, for me, closer to home. Numerous works from anthropology and landscape studies have helped understand how cemeteries have become places of illicit activities and contestation between various communities. On the right-hand side, deathscapes, this is a study done in the UK. They found that cemeteries were a space for sometimes very illicit activity because they're often not patrolled, they're underfunded. In the case of the US, it's very, very difficult to get a cemetery or a grave registered in the National Register under Section 106. And so oftentimes they don't get the same amount of funding or protection. The couple individuals I did chat with from the Department of Water Resources who were on night patrol for her headstone found all sorts of very questionable activity, people trying to have sex on top of her headstone, other sorts of drug use, etc. So it does sort of support this idea, I think, that cemeteries, especially rural ones like this, tend to be places where people go to escape other parts of society. We also see in various studies, really good anthropological studies, of how bodies can be sort of made as puppets or pulled like puppet strings. So this is from Catherine Verdery's work in post-Soviet Eastern Europe, where various political leaders were paraded around for many, many months in open caskets around different parts of the former Soviet Union. She says, quote, "Remains are concrete yet protean, they do not have a single meaning, but are open to many different readings. They can be evaluated from many angles and assigned perhaps contradictory virtues, vices, and intentions." And so I've been sort of engaging with some more recent literature on this that deal with cemeteries more broadly and the bodies that are found in mass casualty events or in even smaller clandestine cemeteries. This is from Joyce and Crossland on the left, where they say, "Distancing and sanitizing power of language that accompanies people and bodies that we often find in archaeological writing." I'm certainly guilty of this. I think in our training, for those of us who work with skeletal material, there has been a long history in the medical field to try to create distance. You end up referring to a lot of things as samples or bones or elements, not necessarily as individuals. So that sort of helps reinforce some of this. In the case of Crandall and Herod, they looked at various brothers who had been killed and then gone missing in a fascinating case in Nevada, outside of Las Vegas. And they say the effects of post-mortem agency and how dead bodies appear, disappear, fragment, are reconstructed and destroyed again in larger arenas. And I think we can see that a bit going on with Annie's headstone, the way in which her headstone becomes this sort of focal point for people to either try to provide care, leave flowers, or leave some sort of charms or coins, or try to desecrate. And this can be seen as well in some of Jason de Leon's work. He did fantastic work on the Sonoran Desert on the US side and said that, quote, "Necroviolence, which is the term he coined, was violence both performed and produced through specific treatment of corpses that is perceived to be offensive, sacrilegious, or inhumane by the perpetrator, the victim, or both." And I think this is what we tend to see when we see the toppling of headstones and trying to crowbar headstones off or etch in them or spray paint over them. It's really trying to signal desecration of the body without actually having to physically go dig it up. And this is pretty hard to do in this case because they have these protective cement caps over Ezra and Annie in this particular cemetery. And so finally, I would say that there's this really interesting tangible indexicality from the 6. That 6, if it just said an 8, I don't know if we'd be here talking about this, right? But that 6 has made so many people really wonder whether or not could someone live to 230 years of age. Highest we have is a couple of years over 100, about 112, I believe. So not likely that someone would ever make it to 230, at least not in the 20th century. And so you end up getting this sort of mimesis or snowball effect that happens, that you have local people interpret the 6 as literally carved in stone, it must be true, therefore she lived to 230. Other people interpret it as no, it can't be. But this is how she started sort of gaining this story in local folklore since at least the 1960s when she was moved here. So what's rather interesting, I think, is that we have the age and iconography of Annie Silvers is read as a witch, right, based on the headstone, based on the dates. And this ends up leading to various vandals vandalizing the headstone, probably because they thought she was a witch or upset with the fact that people think she's a witch. But both vandalism and care end up leaving a lot of material traces that becomes visible to other members in the local rural area. This then reinforces Annie's legend of being a witch because there's a lot of vandalism and other sorts of charms or candles lit here. And so you have this interesting sort of process of desecration and creation. That is, each successive act of damage done towards Annie's headstone seems to only, ironically, further reinforce her in local folklore as being a witch. And this is very similar to other stuff that I've gotten to work with in the realm of taphonomy, that is looking at how preservation of biological organisms varies with burial processes. And if we go back way to the origins of taphonomy, we realize that most taphonymists argue that, yes, you tend to have complete skeletons or bones or some sort of organism, and they tend to degrade over time. That's just what soils and exposure and climate do to organisms. But it's not unidirectional in that you're only losing information, it's also adding information. So when a rodent is gnawing at the edges of a bone, that bone in part is gone. We're missing portions of that bone. but it's also added information that there was a rodent there and has eaten it. And that's what toponimists have long argued, and I think there's some similarities of what's going on here, at least in terms of Annie's headstone. So, in terms of concluding thoughts, I often have two, I think, major conclusions. And the first one is specifically for a lot of the students who I work with in here, and that is to please proofread, okay? I've chatted for like an hour about the equivalent of a 20th century typo, right? And if that had not happened, I don't know if we'd be here. So please proofread. It saves me a lot of headache and time and your other professors. But you never know, right? That your typos might have very grave consequences centuries from now, right? If only we can get whoever carved this headstone in a room here today. It'd be fascinating. And then I guess on a more serious note, I follow some of these other anthropologists and archaeologists' work who say the fundamental thing about life is that it's not begin here and there, but it's always going on. And I think Annie died over a century ago, but was socially resurrected and continues to be sort of resurrected and abstracted as a post-mortem witch today. And in this sense, Annie never really quite died peacefully, but was brought into life again in a new light in the local Oroville folklore. I can only hope something as humble as a gravestone like Annie's can show us how to breathe life into spaces of mourning, tragedy, and remembrance. When I had first visited Annie's gravestone over a decade ago, I don't think I ever would have envisioned any of the academic influence Annie would have had on my research, and especially for me working on skeletal biology in central Portugal, I really didn't think there was a connection. But I think cemeteries, whether from the 10th century or the 20th, are social spaces capable of revealing some of the vast array of human experiences and emotions surrounding death. And I think that's something that can really lend itself to all anthropological endeavors. So I mentioned early on the formation of the Women of Woodcraft was done by Miss Carrie Van Orsdal. She also, coincidentally, organized a lot of the death rituals for the Women of Woodcraft. And she says here, quote, "We stand about an open grave in the final resting place of the early garden of our neighbor, wore so worthily and well. With trembling lips, we falter out our grief and protest. The clouds of our affliction close about us, and courage fails. We reach out our puny hands to catch but empty air." And in her specific manual for the burial and unveiling services of fellow Women of Woodcraft, we see that she quotes here, "There is no death, what seems so is transition. The life of mortal breath is but a suburb of the land Elysian, whose portals we call death." And so, I cannot help but think the ways in which that Annie Silver's life, as a mother, wife, daughter, sister, who took her husband's likely anglicized Portuguese last name and died at the age of 30 from illness in a rural setting, and received a headstone commissioned by an early 20th century feminist auxiliary insurance agency, differs so much from her post-mortem life today in the way we see her. I also cannot help but think that Annie Silver's The Witch became a witch likely due to the equivalent of today's typos, but more importantly, paired with the continued interest and engagement of the living community in Oroville today, even centuries removed. So who knows, we may all become witches yet. Thank you.